ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
What do Rasputin, Tupac and Pharaoh Ramses III have in common? No, it's not the weirdest boy band ever. They all met their end at the hand of an assassin. From seizing power to silencing dissidents, Assassins unpacks the moments in which someone decides that murder is the move. Search Assassins with Aslan Pahari on the ABC Listen app or wherever you get your podcasts.
He's been seen as leadership material ever since he entered the Parliament a decade ago. But are Andrew Hastie's far-right leanings that have brought the likes of Nigel Farage to prominence in the UK an attraction for voters here? Today, Tony Barry, a former Liberal Party strategist and director at RedBridge Group, on Andrew Hastie's resignation from the Coalition frontbench and whether it's a move that will pay off. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Tony, let's chat first about who Andrew Hastie is, his background and really what he stands for. Before he entered politics, of course, he was a Special Forces soldier. He apparently signed up to the Defence Force after the attack on the Twin Towers in 2001.
I remember watching it unfold on television that night. Terror had touched my life and entered my personal world. I had to respond.
So he had a lengthy time in the military, didn't he?
Yeah, he's not your white bread sort of cookie cutter politician. He's got a very diverse background, a very interesting background. I think his mother worked in childcare and his father was a pastor, and he travelled around Australia a fair bit as they moved for his father's job. So he's not, your sort of silver spoon sort of liberal that, some people perceive liberals to be.
Yeah.
And of course, he's served in combat, which makes him quite unique.
Yeah, in Afghanistan, of course. It was in 2015 that he swapped his military attire for a political suit. One of his key allies back then, of course, was Tony Abbott, wasn't it?
Yeah, he came in at the passing of the late Don Randall in the seat of Canning in 2015. And I think that by-election was just before Tony Abbott lost the Prime Ministership.
I'm very proud to be standing shoulder to shoulder with Andrew Hastie. I am happy to take every opportunity that I can to stand next to this absolutely outstanding Australian.
I think he had quite a few mentors, and certainly in Western Australia, he got along well with Matthias Cormann and Julie Bishop, who were both the most senior figures at the time. But, he was seen as sort of having a bright future, so he sort of made friends very fast in the Liberal Party.
Yeah, all right. So he entered politics a decade ago. Very early on, he was talking about leadership. He was even doing that in his maiden speech.
I thank the regiment for their support and for those officers and soldiers who have invested time in me to improve me both as a person and as a leader. You know who you are, who dares wins.
Do you think he saw himself as a potential leader even from the beginning of his political career?
I remember Amanda Vanstone in 25 years ago as a senator saying, all the House of Reps, they all see themselves as a future Prime Minister one day.
Yes.
And I think that's very true. But obviously, he showed leadership skills in the military. So I don't think that's a misplaced confidence at all.
Yeah.
But I think probably what was sort of quite influential on his political career was in 2022 where the Morrison government lost, and he had a massive swing against him of around 8%. He hung on to his seat, but it became a very marginal seat. And of course, he improved his margin at the last election, 2025. And so I think that's kind of influenced a lot of his thinking and his behaviour subsequently. He's very focused on his seat and he understands his seat very well.
He can be quite controversial, can't he? I mean, he said that women should not serve in combat roles in the military. He abstained from the same-sex marriage vote.
My personal view is that the fighting DNA of a close combat unit is best preserved when it's exclusively male. I am personally opposed to same-sex marriage, but I am very much in favour of the Australian people having a popular vote to decide this crucial issue.
Very recently, of course, he said he'd quit the front bench if the coalition didn't abandon net zero.
I mean, everyone is whispering that anyway, so I may as well just say it out loud. You know, I've nailed my colours to the mast. I went on four corners and I said the net zero policy is a straitjacket for our economy and our country, and I believe that.
Is that a key to why his electorate likes him?
Well, I think, we're in an era where voters crave authenticity, even if it's not something that might be considered a popular view, but at least you've got a view and it's a strong view and you articulate it. So I think he gets a reward for that. But he's certainly someone who I think he recognises he's got to expand his portfolio interests beyond just being, the military guy. And there's been a lot of briefings in the media about how he wanted to get into a more economic portfolio, which of course would give him greater credentials to potentially run for the leadership down the track.
Would you say that he sits on the far right in terms of the political spectrum?
Yeah, I think that's a fair characterisation. Yeah.
The federal Liberal MP Andrew Hastie has quit the shadow cabinet because of a disagreement about immigration policy.
I thought it was time for me to depart because essentially I want to be able to speak about immigration, which I think is a critical issue for a lot of Australians at the moment.
And while he says policy is at the heart of the matter, Susan Lee's recollection differs. In a statement, she says Mr Hastie did not raise any matters relating to policy on this call.
Well, last Friday, of course, he did quit the front bench, and immediately the thought of all commentators was leadership, that leadership was in his mind, that he would challenge Susan Lee, even if he was insisting that he wouldn't. So do you think that is ultimately what he is after here?
Well, I think they're all after, sort of leadership at some point, and positioning is incredibly important. But I do feel that if he was wanting the leadership sooner rather than later, he's sort of jumped the gun a little bit too early in that regard. I think you need to show a little bit more patience if that's his short-term game. I think the longer-term game would be to sit down and start sort of broadening your portfolio interests.
All right. Well, he has been described, Tony, as a de facto leader of the so-called MAGA right of the Liberal Party. He does advocate for Australia first. And, he campaigns on the threat to Western values, right? We can see that after the assassination of Charlie Kirk in the United States and comments he made after that, including on Sky News.
Well, Charlie Kirk's political assassination was designed to silence us all. He was willing to step out into the arena and engage with his opponents. And he was doing that very thing when he was cut down by a sniper's bullet.
Just tell me about that. Just tell me about his thinking in that regard.
Yeah, I think the problem with that kind of pitch is that it's to a very narrow part of the electorate. I think one of the most important things for the Liberal Party to remember is that we're a broad church, not an actual church. And the electorate is very different to what it was when John Howard was Prime Minister. Now, John Howard was a great Prime Minister and a very successful one. But I think a lot of people pull out the 2004 John Howard playbook and think they can make it relevant today. Well, Australia's a very different electorate. Harking back to that era and sort of thinking you can dust off the old playbook and make it relevant today is not going to fly. And that sort of nostalgia for the Australia that existed in 2004 is just not relevant anymore to most voters. And you can talk about, starting up an Australians for an Australian Australia and, get into this very pro-nationalistic sort of message to the electorate. But it's a very diverse electorate now. And there's a big Indian community in Australia who, quite frankly, without stereotyping, should be voting Liberal. They're great wealth accumulators, very hardworking. They want choice. They want choice in education. They want choice in health. These are all Liberal values. And it's as a Liberal, I find it incredibly frustrating that we haven't better reached into these communities and articulated our values and aligned them with their values. This very lazy policy development about, we're going to criminalise anyone who burns a flag. No voter's going to vote on that. And what we're seeing in a lot of our polling and research right now is the coalition, the Liberal Party in particular, is really struggling in the Gen Z and millennial cohorts, which is basically any voter up to the age of 45. In both those cohorts, the coalition in our most recent polling are polling 18% amongst Gen Z, which is catastrophic, and around 25% with millennials. Now, at the next federal election, the projections are that about 48% of the electoral roll will be Gen Z and millennial. So almost half the electoral roll.
Well, let's look then, Tony, at whether someone like Andrew Hastie might make them competitive in those cohorts. The message, of course, after the election for the coalition was that the party really needed to move towards the centre, that MAGA, far right, does not work here. Do you think that's still the case, that Gen Z and millennials don't want that?
I think there's a couple different things at play here. When people talk about reform, Nigel Farage and MAGA and so forth, one of the big differences between Australia and the United States and United Kingdom is they have voluntary voting. And so the last elections, there was just under 60% in both constituencies. I think 57% in the UK, 59% in America, I think. But both were under 60%. So 40% of the electorate didn't even vote. In Australia, because of compulsory voting, you get around 91, 92% of the electorate will vote. 8% won't turn up on the day. And so therefore, you need to pitch to the centre a lot more than these other jurisdictions. In the UK and the United States, there is a very large cohort of what we call news avoiders or disengaged voters who just, they sort of feel there's no difference between each major party and they don't turn up to vote. In Australia, you can't ignore or gloss over that middle cohort or the news avoiders. You need to pitch your message and your policies across the whole 92% of the electoral roll that are voting. And so people get confused with this sort of what we're seeing in the United States and the United Kingdom and sort of think, well, let's do that here in Australia. Well, that's not going to fly because, you're pitching a message to a very narrow section of the electoral roll where you actually need, we're in the game of getting 50 plus 1%.
So people like Andrew Hastie then would be in the wilderness, wouldn't they? You're sort of suggesting there that there's no way if he went down Nigel Farage's path and set up a far-right populist group here, that would succeed. There's no way that could succeed here. So where has he left himself at this point?
Well, I think, again, this is one of the misunderstandings of some of those who advocate for a similar sort of MAGA reform type movement here in Australia, the so-called culture wars. But the bottom line is that across all demographics, cost of living and housing is the number one issue. The number one issue of the younger voters, and including their parents and grandparents in our focus group research, is housing attainability and their ability to get into the housing market. That's the biggest driver of their vote considerations, not some of these sort of culture war issues. I think what some members of the Liberal Party are forgetting is that they actually need to win government, and then they can start implementing some of these so-called cultural issues that they think is important. But this is what Labor does. They make sure they win the election, get into government, and then they pursue some of these issues that they're particularly interested in that, sort of aren't as salient as the economic management.
All right, so for the opposition, for Susan Lee, should they just see this as all just noise and continue down the same path that they're currently on? It matters, doesn't it, Tony, because oppositions in democracy, they need to be strong. They're vital.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Susan Lee, to her credit, she hasn't been given much opportunity, and I think, they smashed the Kingswood. They tossed the car keys to Susan Lee and said, there you go, she's all yours. And 6 months later, they're sort of, is it roadworthy yet? It's not roadworthy. Well, no, of course it's not going to be roadworthy. It's, been totaled. It's going to take a long time to get the roadworthy certificate for this car. And that's going to require, going back to basics, articulating a vision, showing what your values are and making them relevant to voters.
Tony Barry is a former Liberal Party strategist and director at RedBridge Group. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Jessica Wukyanov. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawling. To get in touch with the team, please email us on ABC News Daily at abc.net.au. Thanks for listening.